So on the next slide, we've got our speakers. We are 6 today. 2 of us, Joost and I, being from the NetZeroCities consortium, and 4 speakers who are more on the expert and city side. We've got first Fraser, who's coming from LDA design and will talk us through his work with the city of Exeter on creating a portfolio approach. Then we've got Ron from the city of Reykjavik, who will be running us through the mobility challenge in Reykjavik. And last, we've got Sophie and Borge, who will talk us through the work of Oslo using a climate budget as a way of coordinating their actions. So we can already start, I think, with the first more introduction framing side of this portfolio. If you go to the next slide, please, Tom, I think Joost will be able to present to you those first few slides.
Thank you. My name is Joost Boonderman. Great to see you all today. What I wanted to focus on is just in a few introductory slides, some of the key takeaways for today. The portfolio approach has been presented in the webinar on the Climate City contract as in many ways the heart of the action plan. It's a key way of connecting across all the different domains and all the different levers for change, the different actions that a city, together with all the relevant actors right across that city, can take. But more than anything, it's a way of thinking about action planning as a process. So much more than being just a document. The portfolio approach is really a way of working together with different actors across the city to coordinate and connect different potential actions and make sure there is synergy in achieving the objective and in closing the gap between what we're able to do now and what we need to be able to do to reach the 2030 goals. So portfolios can also exist at many scales, right? So obviously we're talking here about the whole city portfolio of actions across different domains to achieve the whole city goal. But of course, really what you'll find is that within particular sectors of the mission domains, there will be portfolios of different actions. At lower scale, you can also, at a geographical scale, think of a portfolio of actions at a district scale, or even within, for those cities applying to the Pilot Cities program, even at that level, when addressing a particularly complex challenge, the solution is rarely just one single technological intervention. There's always a need for a series of coherent, complementary actions to come together right across technology, governance, finance, new business models and business cases, data, etc. And what we don't want to suggest here is that there's one single way of getting portfolios right. This is not about imposing a particular methodology. This is about that way of thinking, where really the core of it all is connecting actions, but also connecting people, connecting the actors in the municipality and beyond that need to be connected in order to ensure that different actions that a city might take are indeed synergistic, work together well, unlock and overcome barriers, aren't just about the direct and visible interventions in a city. Tram lines, bicycle paths, photovoltaics, but also about the enabling factors, governance, regulations, etc. And to ensure that we move forward in a coherent way where these enabling factors and the visible actions support each other. What we want to do today is set a first step together on understanding how to use them through examples, and we'll have plenty of opportunity to explore what this means more technically, deeper over time, together with the city advisors and with more detailed advice. Next slide, please. So like we said, this is a unique initiative, and so many different projects and sub-projects are part of that initiative. But we use the concept of portfolios to enable ourselves to think beyond our future action plans, being just a list of the different projects that need to be undertaken. It's these interventions across the domains and across the different levers of change that need to be connected. That's the way for them to achieve the co-benefits in terms of jobs and health and other important social outcomes, achieve effective allocation of resources and unlocking co-investment, as Roman Mendel already said in one of the introductory webinars. Often actions on their own can be too small in order to interest larger institutional investors, for example. And so there is that financial aspect of portfolio thinking as well. And we will go into that in some of the examples. But again, if we go to the next slide, most of all, it's about people. Connecting actions is important. Connecting people is even more important. And for example, we've worked over time with the city of Vienna, not part of the mission, but a leading city where it comes to the drive towards climate neutrality nevertheless. And when we spoke with them after 2-3 years of working together, when we asked what is the key impact that our way of working with you has had, one of the things they said was that the city now has, as a result of this portfolio approach, a group of municipal civil servants right across the different departments that matter. And in Vienna, they have many different municipal departments that matter for the climate transition, that are on an everyday and every week level better connected. They speak each other's language. They look for each other in order to see if they can combine projects, to see if they can make sense of the barriers that they face together. So this co-production of a portfolio is a people's process, bringing together the different internal municipal stakeholders and beyond. And that's the only way of connecting those different actions. So as a process, the portfolio co-design allows that ownership and the commitment of a wide range of actors for the actions that a city is to take. And it also makes it possible to iterate what's in the action plan over time. Again, if we recognize that creating a portfolio is an ongoing process, because you always need to connect new people and new opportunities, what you might submit in your action plan is a snapshot in time, sort of a latest status update of where the city is at that point in time. But the portfolio creation and the portfolio iteration and the strengthening of links goes on and on and on. And those are some of the core principles. Again, it's about connecting actions, connecting people, and always steering towards synergy, which you need to do both because that has greatest possible co-benefits in real life, and because that's needed for optimum financial resource allocation. And with those few first introductory and orientation points, I'll hand over to my colleague, Virginie.
Thank you, Joost. So to organize a little bit today's webinar, we created 3 headlines. And first, we're trying to connect what portfolio is to the previous stage in the climate transition, which is understanding the system. Obviously, creating a portfolio means having clear understanding of where you sit in terms of your GHG emissions. So that means having a baseline, which is giving you an idea of where you need to focus attention, what are the big emissions, what are the big emitters, and who should be around the table as a consequence, and what kind of big numbers do you need to focus on. It's obviously also analyzing the current state of your action, sort of pulling together the different policy strategies that you have in your current policy and regulation field, and analyzing their progresses, their learnings, and understanding the independencies between the various domains of emissions that you have, as well as the different actors, the different strategies and action you've put in place. And that's useful because that's giving you an idea of what are the barriers that are blocking you in your progress towards actual climate neutrality. And finally, the last element you might base yourself to create a portfolio is having those scenarios with those potential levers of change turned into an actual trajectory toward net zero. And what is that trajectory looking like? What are the best scenarios? So this is what we're basing ourselves on. And can we go to the next slide? This is helping us to structure today's webinar to have 3 headlines. The first one is on diversity of action. Essentially, the idea that a portfolio is really a diverse set of actions. They're not just technologies. They are also regulations. There are also elements that are more financial. There are elements of culture and democracy, and how do you actually govern this transition? There are elements where you have to involve capability building in people in your teams, but also in the other ecosystem, the other actors that you're working with. This is a little bit what this representation on the right is showing. It's the idea that to get to net zero mobility, you sort of need 2 scales of action. The first one, which are direct actions, active actions that are triggering GHG emission reductions directly, because there are actions that are acting on, for example, modes of travel, or on the type of behaviors of people, what kind of travel modes they are using. But there are also passive actions in a portfolio, which is more the altering, the type of action that are enabling the direct action to even be possible. That can be, for example, working on with the community on behavior change to make sure that the bicycle lanes that you're creating are actually being used and are in the right places. Those kind of enabling actions. And all of this can happen across emission domains. It means that it doesn't necessarily mean that for mobility, other sectors of action are not relevant. Typically, we see that logistic elements affect a lot land use, and all of this is having an impact on typically your emissions around transport. So this is the type of cross-cutting action that we're talking about that are very diverse. Obviously, what you're seeing here is just one representation of what a portfolio could look like. And in the other presentation of our speakers, you'll see different ways of representing what a diversity of action is needed. On the next slide, we've got our second headline, which is the idea of coherence. There are diverse actions and they are coherent. It means that they are directed and prioritized to achieve a goal, which is one of GHG emission reduction. So obviously you're using those criteria such as GHG emission reduction, but also their costs, but also who is going to implement them, as well as are they targeting those actions, the real barriers that are blocking our progress. Those are the type of things that can be used to create the coherence and to prioritize what could be an unlimited number of actions sometimes. And working on coherence essentially allows a city as a collective to be working towards its city vision, to make sure that the actions are aligned to the values the city wants to work on and with. So the idea of coherence is not only on coherence regarding emissions, but also coherence regarding the kind of vision that you have. And the last element of coherence is around creating pathways, making sure that those actions are articulated with one another, that they build on top of each other to make sure that you're actually creating a cascade, a pathway toward emission reduction. And I think we've got a last headline before I hand over to the speakers on the next slide, which is what Joost was already mentioning, the idea that a portfolio is a multi-stakeholder process. It's difficult to implement a portfolio, let alone come up with one. if you're not working with a composition of actors. We know that city council, municipalities do not always own all of the parts of the system which need to be changed. And we know that you need to work with other actors. That's why the process of co-creating a portfolio is a co-creation and is deeply embedded in the idea of activating an ecosystem, developing an ecosystem, because understanding who are the actors that are relevant, because there are big emitters, because they are heavily affected, because they need to be in the conversation. That's something that is crucial in making sure that this process even is possible and that implementation will be successful. This is essentially building collaboration through the process of coming up with a portfolio. That's something that is incredibly useful on a long-term basis. So those are the three headlines we've worked with our speakers, and they will be essentially talking through the different examples that they are embedded in, giving us a bit of an idea of how diverse are the actions they're working with, how articulated, coherent, coordinated those actions are, and how they came up with them, but also who did they involve in the process. So on the next slide, we've got our first speaker, which is Fraser. He's coming from LDA design and he's working on the city of Exeter. And he's got an amazing presentation for us with a lot of incredible visualizations, which I'm sure everyone is going to appreciate. Happy to leave you the floor, Fraser, and let us know when you need to change slides.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon all. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm Fraser Osman. I'm the chair of LDA Design, and we're a business of about 180 planners, landscape architects and master planners based in the UK. And I head up the strategy for the business. And I'm going to talk to you today predominantly about a project that I've been involved in the southwest of England. But before I do that, I just want to do a little bit of scene setting. So if you want to go to the next slide. And the next. This is the final sentence of the IPCC report in 28th of February 2022. Given the audience today, I probably don't need to restate that, but I do think that one of the interesting things about responding to climate emergency is sometimes we don't hold on to those words and we don't really see how strong they are. And really the fact that we're talking about rapidly closing window to secure a livable future really should be a prompt to action. And the work that we're doing in Exeter very much sort of tries to respond to that and tries to take a holistic response to addressing and rising to that challenge. So next slide. Our own journey in understanding this and understanding the degree of change that was needed as a business was when we were commissioned by the Royal Town Planning Institute, which is the national body representing planners in the UK, to do a bit of research to look at net zero transport and the role of spatial solutions to decarbonise transport. And we teamed up with City Science and Vectos and that, who are two consultants we work with in the UK, to make sure that we took a science-based approach. If you go to the next slide. And what we did in that work was very interesting. You know, we've effectively developed a model which built on the Department of Transport's decarbonisation tool. And we modelled the impact of various different measures that could be taken to decarbonise transport. And we looked at those with respect to best available data that we could get hold of at the time. And we really looked at how each of those could have an impact if all done together in terms of decarbonising transport in the UK. And in the UK, I think transport is accountable for well over a third now of emissions, and it's the biggest emitter by some way now. So next slide. In doing all of that work, what we did is we set ourselves a carbon budget that tied into the 2030 targets to And these were very science-based targets. So effectively, we worked out how much of the CO2 reduction by 2030 transport needed to contribute to. And I don't want to go into the detail. You can find this on the RTPI website. But what we found is really all of those 40 interventions that we uncovered and that we modeled really needed to be done all at the same time in order for us to have any chance of getting from where we are now, which is transport being the bigger emitter, to where it needs to be by 2030, which is effectively an 80% drop. So you can see those reductions in each of that waterfall graph in front of you. And I'm not going to talk about that today, but I do suggest have a look at the report if you can get hold of it. If you go to the next slide, what that really meant for us actually is that each of those interventions, we realized, weren't just about making a minor adjustment to a particular technology. For example, our public transport, or how we park our cars, or how we move around the city. Actually, if you put them all together, it means that we need to be creating different types of city. So this was not about tinkering, it's actually about transformational change. And for us, that was a huge kind of penny dropping moment. It was which really brought home the scale of the change that needed to be made. So moving on to the next slide. We've been working for some time now with the city of Exeter, and Exeter's a relatively small city in the southwest of England. It's got a population of about 130,000, but within its immediate area, there's about 280,000 people who live and work and rely on the city. So it's got quite a large catchment. It's surrounded by a fantastic natural environment. Next slide. What Exeter had already started to do when we got involved is it had formed a partnership expressly to help it deliver on its net zero ambitions. So Exeter City Futures is an organisation that was set up as a community interest company expressly to work in partnership with the City Council in order to work towards achieving its 2030 net zero plan. And that's a really interesting synergy because the council has an entrepreneurial and enabled partner with a strong tech understanding to help support it in its ambition to achieve net zero by 2030. And that's been going for over 5 years now. Next slide. At the heart of the Livable Exeter proposition was an understanding of the city as a system. And I think this is really kind of important, to what it is about. And effectively, when we got involved, we developed a spatial framework and a spatial understanding of the city, which really helped to give clarity about those things that needed to be done to ensure that Exeter stayed a successful city, a livable city, but also was on a journey towards net zero. And to make it very simple, because I think the ability to communicate this is really important, we broke it down into 3 very simple kind of moves. It was about strengthening the economic drivers, because Exeter needed to continue to be successful on the world stage as a place for investment, as a place to live. But it was also about enhancing the environment of the city and driving those qualities that were essential to make it a walkable city, that to make active travel the natural choice, and so on. And then it was about investing in the communities and the neighbourhoods. And at the heart of the Livable Exeter proposition was the idea that this was about making the city better for people. It wasn't just some abstract net zero process, and it wasn't just about economic development or housing growth, for example. It was called Livable Exeter to make it resonate with the people of the city. So the next slide. To underpin that basic strategy, we developed a very simple kind of delivery approach, which helped the local authority, Exeter City Council, think about how it did things. And in many ways, what we were saying here is, if we think about how Exeter stays prosperous, if we think about how we invest in its communities and neighbourhoods, and if we think about how we create great streets and great open spaces that connect those things up, we will end up with a good, livable city that also sets the framework on which we can build a net zero future. So that pillar of delivery was really at the heart of the proposition. Next slide. That's all been taken forward into the Exeter plan. So in the UK, you'll probably know that each local authority has to have its own local plan, and that's a legal requirement. And Exeter are just developing their new local plan at the moment. And embedded in the heart of that local plan is a commitment to its net zero future, but equally importantly, the livable Exeter proposition stands absolutely central to that. So planning is not just a matter of land allocation and transport and social issues. It's a joined up proposition to deliver on that mission, if you like, of a livable future. So the next slide. Underpinning that and embedded in the local plan are 6 principles. Now, these don't mention carbon neutrality because that's inherent in everything that is in the plan. But what it does do is it tries to draw out 6 principles that we feel and the City Council feels are really fundamental to delivering on that livable future. And I won't go through all of those, but these are specifically developed to encourage the delivery of the sorts of outcomes that we want to see achieved through planning and development processes. And we're talking to them at the moment about embedding this in approaches to design review, to scheme review, and to development planning processes to make sure that in everything these principles are adhered to. Next slide. Underpinning that are kind of 8 key projects. So if we just recap a little bit, you have the spatial plan, you have the carbon plan, you have the local plan, which embeds it in policy, you have the principles that really pin that down, and then there are the projects that, when developed, will deliver on some of the promise of the livable vision. And again, I won't go through each of these projects in detail, but effectively we're talking about creating 2 significant new neighbourhoods to the city, improving the approaches to the city. But I think perhaps most importantly, we're talking about a coordinated investment in the environmental infrastructure of the city to set that essential framework on which people can move around the city differently, that transport will operate differently, nature will be embedded in the city in a more positive way. Next slide. To complement that, we've been talking, and the City Council has adopted an approach to think about its sites as a portfolio of sites. So traditionally what's happened in the city, every single site gets cherry picked. So they get isolated by a developer and then they get developed on their own terms as a development proposition, but they're not necessarily developed to benefit the wider city. So what we're seeking to encourage here is an approach in which we're thinking through every site that is developed, how we achieve those wider goals that are embedded in the livable kind of Exeter proposition. Effectively, we call that a master developer perspective. So it's encouraging the local authority to think more like a master developer, to manage its land, to control phasing and placemaking, to set a new benchmark for quality, to build a new brand and identity, and to get some of that investment into infrastructure up front to really start to transform the city. Next slide. And linked to that, and this is crucial, is the notion of a city fund. So one of the big problems, in the UK generally, actually, but in Exeter, it's certainly the case, is that the private sector has led development processes, and then because of viability issues, has been able to say that actually they can't fund the public goods that really should be accompanying development, and that's led to development that's not quite as good as we would hope for. In order to overcome that, what Exeter are doing is they're developing something called the City Fund, which effectively is a single pot which will invest in assets, it will finance development, it will renew infrastructure, and it will lever investment into the city. And the idea is that is a fund which attracts private sector investment as a basis for funding future kind of growth in the city. And again, I can provide links for some of that information if you'd like to see it. Next slide. I think I'm nearly there. Finally, to tie it all together, there is something which is called Place Board. Now, the Place Board, they're called the Livable Exeter Place Board, is a group of the key institutions and the key stakeholders in the city who meet together to collaborate and to really think about how they address this huge challenge of delivering the livable Exeter proposition across the city. So it plays a critical friend role. It doesn't have a formal planning role, but actually because it's made up of the university, the hospital, and the big, powerful institutions of the city, it carries quite a lot of weight in helping the local authority stay true to its vision. And it also helps engage communities and stakeholders as well. I think that I have one more slide. So I just wanted to end on that really. In Exeter, this is still very much developing. I think the livable proposition has been developing over the last 3 years. The carbon plan has been around, and thinking of that has been around for the last 4 or 5 years. So it is still an emerging approach, but hopefully in terms of how you can see a portfolio of things coming together and hopefully a sort of coherence to that. You can sort of see the value in what we're trying to do there in order to really position the city to address its challenges of growth and economic development, but also climate neutrality in a holistic way. So thank you very much. That's me done.
Thanks a lot, Fraser. It was great to see. We can move to the next slide so that, again, the next slide, you're introducing yourself very well, Fraser, on every slide. So Fraser showed us a type of portfolio, which is including place-based intervention, which is including financial intervention, and which is including, obviously, governance, more capacity building type of intervention. And now we're going to have Ron from the city of Reykjavik introducing us to Reykjavik's work around mobility as well. Ron, are you here? And yeah. I'll leave you the floor so that you can explain us everything you're doing.
Yes, thank you. And hello, you hear me well? Great. And thank you for the presentations before me. This has been very interesting and learningful to listen to you guys. Well, my name is quite Icelandic and hard to pronounce. It's Hrönn Hrafnsdóttir. It's easier to call me just like Ron. It's like in running, actually. Well, I am here up in Reykjavik in the north of Europe at the island of Iceland. We are located here in a meeting room, me and my colleague Karen, who is also being one of the participants here today. Well, I just wanted to tell you about the climate work at Reykjavik City and a little bit about me and us here at the climate work within the city. Well, me and Karen, we are located at the Department of Environment and Planning. And actually we are a part of a team that is also with the municipal plan as well. So it's, how can I say it? It's a team that is called Municipal Plan and Climate Action. And we are located directly beneath the director of the Environment and the Planning Department. So it's on a policy level, actually, just to introduce you where this is located within the city of Reykjavik. But I also wanted to tell you about the largest challenge for Reykjavik City to become carbon neutral. And the largest challenge is mobility, actually. And I want to show you the numbers, but also the diverse actions that are needed to tackle the challenge, and also, how can you say, the multi-stakeholder processes we have been and are following. And maybe this is a, how can you say it, this is a similar approach as it is with Exeter, that this is a part of the planning. But I wanted to maybe take you a little bit more into details how we made the action plan and what kind of people are involved in the planning. Next slide, please. Well, this is actually the numbers, and it's maybe a little bit of a complicated table, but I wanted to show you this because we have a different kind of calculations. This is 3 kinds of calculations if you look into the columns, but how can you say it? It doesn't matter how we calculate greenhouse gas emissions. It's always the largest proportion or percentage that is due to transport. It's if we only take like the scope 1 emissions or the closest in basic calculations, then it's 82%, and its lowest is 54%, and then we have like scope 3 emissions calculated as well. So you see that this is the largest proportion of emissions that are due to transport, and that is, of course, how can you say it, a complicated and diverse set of action that needs to be taken. Next slide, please. So if you're looking at the picture here to the left, I'm sorry, this is in Icelandic, but I think you recognize the drawings. And it's like a diverse triangle. And this is a picture from our municipal plan that was accepted in 2014, but there were made some revision on it last year. And this is the goal on actually changing the travel modes, and it is within the municipal plan, and maybe also similar like at the Exeter, we are taking neighborhood solutions and so on, that it's easier to walk and bicycle within the city. But if we're looking at the picture, then if you're looking at the triangle, the main emphasis will be on walking pedestrians. And the second one is on bicycling, and then on public transport, then on taxis actually, and shared mobility, and finally on the private car. That will be, how can you say it, that will be the focus is to have that least used of transport within the city. And you see below the numbers, the plan is to reduce, we have around 75% of citizens traveling by car right now. We have urban sprawl, and that is a challenge, of course, both planning and social changes within the community. And there is a plan on changing public transportation up to 15% and bicycling and walking to 35%. And this is, we are looking at this until 2040. That was the revision of the municipal plan. But then the climate action plan and the municipal plan is very much connected, because we, in the municipal plan, we are talking about the climate action plan and actually making a revision to that, and also vice versa in the climate action plan as well. But again, of course, planning is legally built on consultation with the public. So also built on participation of the politicians, and the municipal plan in 2014 that was made with all the parties, political parties at that time. It actually took some years, but this was an agreement that was finalized back then in 2014. And in 2016, well, a little bit getting back again, we made the policy on climate in 2011 in connection with the participation of covenant of mayors and so on. But in 2016, it was decided to make the vision of being climate or carbon neutral by 2040. And then it was set a detailed action plan as well. And that action plan was revised last year. We had like maybe on a practical note, we had like the action plan, and I thought it was so good. I think that Thomas said it's like a snapshot of the reality as it is now. And we did the detailed action plan back in 2016, but it was decided to review it at least every 5 years. And I think that is it's a good thing to do, to revise it very regularly. Next slide, please. But I just, again, on a very practical note, I wanted to emphasize or focus on what kind of multiple actors we need for a multiple stakeholder process, at least. So this is how can I say it? Of course, every actor has multiple roles, but if we're talking about the role of the politicians, it is they are elected to set the vision and finance it and make priorities in the financing and so on. And citizens, they are the people asking for change, and the municipal plan is to set the big picture of growth limit and how also the changes of the city, how the future of the city will be, how we see it for people that are living and growing within the city. And then on more specific manners is like the planning department to plan special areas. I'm talking there about pedestrian friendly areas, but that is of course only one of the aspects that they are taking care of. And then we have a division of urban development that is thinking about employment and services and businesses and so on, that they keep in mind to keep the service within 50-minute districts, and that it will be easy to walk and take public transportation and so on. And we have our daughter company or utility company for electricity and so on. And they are so important in the energy exchange of cars within Reykjavik City and also of the public transport system as well. Then we have the Reykjavik Harbor for energy exchange at sea. We are located by the sea, and actually fisheries are a very large proportion of our employment within the city. And the public transportation company that is owned by 7 municipalities nearby Reykjavik City. It's very important that they go ahead with tasks like more frequent services and electrification of the fleet to go the path towards carbon neutrality. And then we have like in-house the transport department that is a key actor on changing travel modes, but also how can I say it, push forward for a plan like the bicycle plan to come true, because they are dedicated to that kind of mobility as well. And then on car parking services, to make fees for the car parking and actually limiting, maybe how can I say it, as you know, car parking fees, they increase the possibility of services for each car parking. And then we have NGOs pushing on bicycling, and last but not least, also the nearby municipalities that are extremely important. We are having like 7 municipalities nearby. Total, we are around 200,000 in the near area, and people are living maybe in one municipality and working within Reykjavik and vice versa. So it's extremely important to work together with other municipalities around as well. But if you're looking at the picture at the right, we have a lot of actions in the action plan, and it was maybe a little bit a kind of a wishing list. We had the public sending in ideas. We are through a portal, just a web portal, with meetings with stakeholders and so on. It's maybe something that you're aware of and are familiar to working an action plan like this. But what was decided to draw out like 15 main actions, and 5 of them are actually related to the main challenge, to the transport challenge. Because this is a diversity of actions to focus on different solutions for the challenge. There is a focus on pedestrians, bicycle friendly, and also to be able to use public transport more, but then also on electrifying of the car fleet as well. Next slide, please. I wanted to, sorry, my paper's a little bit here lost. Yes, and maybe just a little bit on the practical side. I'm talking about this if this is something that you could use in your work ahead. Actually, just I want to mention that we looked at the action plan of Vancouver City, just to let you know. And how can I say it? They had an emergency plan, and there were some kinds of things that we looked up and looked at their action plan when we were working ours as well. So that is very good to find something that you relate to and can have a copycat on. We of course mentioned that in the text for the action plan, just to be clear on that. But here I was talking about the 15 actions that are in the focus, and that I showed to you in the prior slides, and then the 5 of them are focusing on mobility. But in addition to that, there are a lot of actions in the action plan. There are about hundreds of them, and there are a lot of ideas from the public, stakeholder meetings, and so on. And I'm of course not going to go over all of them in this 50-minute slot we have here today. But I just wanted to see you and show that we estimated each action with a rough estimate on cost, you know, if it would be costly and so on. And then we had success measurements and effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And then last but not least, it was the, how can you say, the actor that would guarantee the action to go through. And here we have the Department of Environment and Planning, but you see in the action plan that it's different kind of departments that actually are the actors within the action plan. But I also again to emphasize on different kind of actors. And I just took an example of like bicycle lanes, because they have been a very huge part of reducing emissions within Reykjavik City, and also to change the travel modes is to build separate bicycle lanes. And of course, the role of politicians, again, it is the role to decide the policy on this and financing of the bicycle lanes. And we actually have a special plan on implementing the bicycle lanes as well. And there is the planning department to locate the bicycle lanes, the transport department with their special knowledge on designing of bicycle lanes and pedestrian streets and so on, and the Department of Construction to build the lanes, and then Department of Maintenance to maintain these lanes. We have a lot of ice and snow in the winter, so there's a very important that there is a snow removal and ice removal as well, so you can use this for transport all year around. And then to follow up through there is a need for statistics on the use of the bicycle lanes. You want to see how much they are used, and also to use it for promotion of the lanes and communication on it as well. We have the NGOs pushing for more service and more lanes, and that is just a good thing to embrace and look at that. And just citizens in general that are interested in more bicycle lanes. And of course, there are always people that curse bicycle lanes and so on, because we have different kind of people with a different kind of vision of life. But this is just an example that this is not something that could be located with a climate department. This is a, how can you say it, a very a complex set of actors that we have to communicate with. That is just wonderful. Okay, next slide, please. Yes, I just wanted to actually bring this all together, and maybe because there is almost more than 10 years since I started with the city, and climate change issues have always been on my table. It was a little bit less in 2011 than it is now. So maybe a little bit about the experience on the path that the climate action plan has been on. And in my opinion, there is very helpful to have strong political commitment. And of course, we as mission cities, we at least have a political commitment on being a mission city. So I find it very helpful to sail, or how can you say it, walk in that path. I also wanted to tell you about when we made the first action plan and finished all of the actions that were made then. We decided to have a large group meeting with multiple actors, and both within the city and outside the city and so on. And well, that was good to make awareness that it was a kind of action plan going on. It is not something that everyone was aware of, but it did not work well as, how can you say it, to make the action for a single actor to take actions like it was appointed to them. So then one-on-one meetings were actually most helpful, and that was the people that was really willing to make a change, that were interested after the large group meeting and also wanted further information on how to do things and so on. And actually, I'm sorry I cannot take examples because this is maybe on a more personal note, but this is maybe that was most effective on the path towards carbon neutrality and changing large parts of the emissions of the city. So I recommend one-on-one meetings with and answer them quickly and be ready to do that. We did not do as much meeting with the boards of stakeholders. I am hoping to do that now in line with the action plan for 2030, because we are talking about 2040 right now. And for the climate contract as well, this is something that I would like to do, to have meeting with boards or stakeholders and implement them in that way with the climate contracts. We have a special website on climate issues, and I highly recommend that. It's very easy to distribute the information and just to have it like in one place. And then of course you have to have the communication people working with you there. And internal and external communication, to have presentations ready that are extremely important. Because as we were talking about in presentations before me, that this is about people connecting and maybe understanding the issue, and also that everybody has a role in this huge process ahead. I also just want to talk briefly. We have Icelandic Climate Council in Iceland, and we have two representatives from the municipalities, and I am luckily one of them. And there we have a different kind of stakeholders that can be very useful connecting further ahead for the climate contracts as well. And I also, maybe the final point is that participation in the mission has been a very positive turning point as well. It is again a renewal of the political commitment that was very clear after the Paris Agreement and the Paris meeting, and the focus on non-state actors at that time. But this is like a renewal of the political commitment, and we are lucky to have a steering committee with the mayor and all the foremen of the political parties. Also the minority, that is a challenging and a different kind of views, but I think it's very important to have them all on board, because again, this is a people process. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards as well, of course.
Thank you, Ron. That's a really good point on questions. You're all welcome to use the Q&A function to start populating the Q&A with questions, and to avoid each other questions, so that at the end, when we go into the debate, you'll be able to essentially get those questions answered by all different speakers. In the meantime, before this debate, we've got Sophie and Borge with us today, and they will be able to present to us part of Oslo's climate strategy and how it's implemented. They are coming from Climate Agency Oslo. Sophie and Borge, are you here?
We are here. Can you hear us okay?
Yes. Amazing.
Well?
Yes, all good.
Great.
Thanks. I'll leave the floor to you, and we'll see each other afterwards.
Thank you. I hope you have the energy to follow. It's always exciting to be the third man out in these sessions, but we will try to keep it simple. Thank you for listening. So we work in the Climate Agency in Oslo, and Oslo has worked seriously to reduce its climate emissions for a long time now. We have one of the most ambitious climate targets of any capital city in the world. By 2030, our goal is to reduce the direct emissions of greenhouse gases by 95%. Next slide, please. Next. Yeah, perfect. In the beginning of our climate work, the focus was more on specific case-by-case measures, but our climate strategies were gradually tightened in scope, realism, and ambition. With the climate strategy that we adopted in 2020, the focus was more holistic and more all-encompassing. We have mainstream climate measures on all levels of city planning. And nevertheless, even if Oslo reaches its zero emission goal, the climate will of course continue to change. So therefore, we also need to adapt to present and future hazards. And therefore, we have a goal to become a climate resilient city by 2030 as well. Next, please. Our climate strategy includes a broad range of goals and climate change related activities, which also encompasses more than just direct emissions. In addition to reducing direct emissions, Oslo will also increase the natural capture of CO2 in the city. We want to reduce total energy consumption. We want to strengthen the city's climate resilience, and we want to reduce the city's climate footprint and further develop and implement climate governance. Next, please. So our climate strategy has been adopted as a consultative and participatory process involving citizens, NGOs, the private sector, and it has of course been adopted by the City Council. And the climate agency in Oslo is the lead agency on the climate work. And we have also been asked to strengthen climate leadership and citizen engagement widely. So therefore, we have a strong focus on climate communication, outreach and dialogue with schools and the youth. We conduct yearly climate polls to make sure that we still have broad-based support for climate policies by the average citizen in Oslo. We run participatory processes on more local district level related to activities on the ground. And we also have community projects related to sustainable urban life, such as urban gardening, for example. We also work together with the academia and the private sector to make Oslo an international test center for climate innovation. And finally, we have worked closely with the private sector in Oslo since 2009. Private companies are members of a coalition called Business for Climate. And in this coalition, companies sign a contract with our vice mayor, where they commit to actively reduce climate emissions in the city. And this collaboration has led to groundbreaking work related to our actions implemented through the climate budget. So my colleague Borge will take over now and go into the details on the climate budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. You hear me okay? Great.
Yeah.
So Sophie said a little bit about what we do on stakeholder engagement and giving you an introduction to our climate goals and our climate strategy. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about this big question: how do we implement? And one of the key challenges for achieving our climate goals is that I believe we need to mainstream climate consideration on all levels of decision making. And there isn't one solution or one technology that will get us there. It's systemic change that we need. And we know that one of the biggest problems to this is this lack of coordinated action and this fragmentation of responsibility for climate action. This is also true in Oslo, and I would imagine in most other cities. And this is kind of the general theme that this webinar is supposed to be about. And I think there can be many different types of solutions to tackling this problem. But for Oslo, for us, it ended up being this implementation of a climate budget, which I'm going to explain what is in the next few slides. So next slide, please. So the key tool to organize our climate work and to operationalize our climate goals in the climate strategy is our climate budget, which we do on an annual basis. And Oslo was, as far as we know, the first city in the world to introduce a climate budget. And we used it for the first time in 2017. And we're now completing our 7th budget for 2023. And it's a bit challenging to describe exactly what the climate budget is, because it is both a document with an analysis that's part of the normal budget. Actually, in practice, it's chapter 2 in the budget. But it's also this process, climate budget process for deciding measures. And this way, it's integrated into the regular budget process. But in short, the climate budget presents emission reductions that are needed to keep a trajectory towards 95% reduction in 2030, which is our climate goal. And it presents climate measures that the government is working to implement the next 4 years, and where possible, quantified emission impacts of these climate measures. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, this climate budget, it's both a document with an analysis and this process for deciding measures. But I thought I'd first start with the actual analysis, the output that appears in our regular budget as a chapter 2. Next slide. And to do so, I thought I'd start with something concrete, which is Oslo's greenhouse gas emissions. So as you can see from this figure, almost 90% of Oslo's emissions come from just 3 sources, from about half from road transport, which is the gray to the right of the screen, cars, trucks, buses. About a quarter the red, waste incineration at 3 different sites. And we also have a large source of emission is this category in yellow called other mobile combustion, which is mostly diggers, excavators, etc., that are used at construction sites. And unlike many cities, which I think makes us unique, is that we have very low emissions from heating, just 2%. And this is because that electricity has traditionally been used in Norway for heating, and the national government has also prohibited the use of heating oil in buildings since 2020. So this puts us in a bit of a unique situation. Next slide, please. So I'm going through this a bit quick, but we only have 15 minutes. But this somewhat complicated figure shows kind of the culmination of the climate budget analysis for 2023. And the dark green line left is historical emissions taken from our greenhouse gas inventory. And the green dotted line furthest up in the figure that stretches to 2030 down to 62%. That shows the estimated impact of existing and new measures that are being decided in this year's climate budget. So that means that this top line, that's where we think we'll be in 2030 with existing measures and all the new climate measures that were decided in this year's budget. The light green dotted line that's a little further down, this is something we called identified measures. And these are measures that the city is, for the most part, working on, but has not decided to implement yet for various reasons. They're being developed, don't have the data yet, etc. And we've estimated that these measures can take us down to around 80% emission reduction. And here it's worth mentioning that these types of projections and calculations, they're always challenging to make, and there's a high level of uncertainty. But doing this process on an annual basis kind of shows us a gradual progress towards our goal. And the gap from 62% down to 95% will next year, in practice, be the basis for next year's climate budget. That's the emission gap, and that's where we need to put the work in to close the gap. And that's one of the things that I like about this process, the climate budget process, and that we do it yearly, is that we yearly have this arena to continually ratchet up efforts. And I think this is important because it's hard to agree on everything at once. Next slide, please. And I thought I'd talk just a little bit about this, this table. No need to read it. It's in Norwegian. Most of you can't. But it deserves a little bit of attention because it's an important table in the climate budget. And what it does is this table shows the climate measures that are estimated that were in the previous graph in the topmost green dotted line. And the value of this table is it links quantified climate measures with responsible entities and who's responsible for reporting and monitoring these climate measures. And this, along with an additional table in the climate budget that shows funding for different types of these different measures, is kind of the core of our climate budget. So next slide, please. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about the climate budget process, because now we've seen sort of the output, what actually appears in the budget, but how is the work organized and how are the measures decided? And I mean, this is where I believe this is where the value of this process is. Next slide, please. So I think the real strength of this climate budget process is that it's embedded in the regular financial budget. We decide on climate measures in much the same way as we decide on expenditures in Oslo. And I won't go through exactly how this works, but this is a regular budget cycle. If you want to hear more about this, then we have some webinars with C40 cities that explain this more. But long story short, climate measures are decided in the budget conferences, just like expenditures and finances. And I think this is what the real value of this process is. Next slide. And after the climate budget is decided and appears in the regular budget, and the council has accepted it, then we start the next year. So in 2023, when this budget has been accepted, we start the reporting cycle. And since the climate budget is part of the financial budget, all the different entities that have their own climate measure, they have to report on the climate measure just like they report on their finances. And I think this is a real value because it gives us kind of this formalized process to follow up climate measures in the city. Thank you. Next slide. And I thought I'd just end this presentation with just some examples to try to make things a little bit more concrete. Next slide. So in 2017, Oslo revised its procurement strategy. And for us at the Climate Agency, where Sophie and I work, this was an opportunity to ensure that we use this powerful tool, this procurement tool, strategically towards our climate goals. And we were very fortunate that we got this clear political signal that we could use this instrument. And through making this strategy, it opened up several years of meaningful work with the Agency for Planning and Development here in Oslo, which is responsible for public procurement. As you can see, Oslo, like many of the cities probably listening here, is a very large buyer of goods and services. So this is kind of a powerful tool. And after this strategy, we made some concrete measures. We started by ensuring that all municipal vehicles were zero emission. We then further developed a standardized contract that ensures that we employ zero emission technology in transport when we purchase goods and services. And now we're using this same strategy for construction sites, where we first have required municipal construction sites to be fossil free, biofuels allowed, and now we're moving towards this emission free requirement, where we're having these electric excavators, etc., working at our sites. And going back to Sophie's presentation and stakeholder involvement, many of these individual measures here were discussed in, for example, our Businesses for Climate group, to kind of get the stakeholders involved in, is this possible to set this type of requirement? And also thinking back to the climate budget process, how does that fit in? And one thing is to have this procurement strategy, but it's another to actually find these individual concrete measures that I mentioned, create a political consensus for them, and then ensure funds were necessary for these measures. So all these measures were at some point evaluated, and their emission effects were estimated, and they were taken through this decision-making process in the budget cycle that I showed earlier. And I thought I'd just close and say that, you know, the system sounds sort of like this perfect system for estimating every impact of every single climate measure and putting it through the system, but it is of course challenging, and it's a work in process. Not everything is quantified, and of course it's challenging with certain measures that aren't followed up, that we have to follow up. But we believe that this sort of formalized process with the climate budget has helped us to follow up and ensure implementation of different measures. Next slide. And that's actually what I had to say. So I would just say thank you there. I don't know if we can read that information quite, but we can maybe fix that. Send it out afterwards.
Yeah, don't worry, Borge, we put it in the chat. So the
Okay,
links
great.
that are here in white are actually in the chat if you want to access them. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It's really good to hear about the climate budget as well. I think if we move to the next slide, Tom, we will be able to start opening the discussion. So essentially we have a rough 35 minutes in front of us, and we will be able to start a discussion with our speakers. We've got Sophie, Borge, Ron that are still here. I think Fraser had to leave for another meeting quickly, but we'll be able to get back to him if you have specific questions for him. So the idea of these 35 minutes is that we're going to start a conversation with the speaker here and use the Q&A function to surface questions that we'd like to ask the speakers. And we're very much like expecting those questions to actually be relevant for a few speakers, in the sense that they do have elements in common with their presentations. So that's why we're having a bit of a panel. And feel free to vote for the questions in the Q&A, because the idea is that the best questions, a little bit, the ones that are the most popular, you can actually get with us on the panel. You can then, we'll essentially give you the opportunity to unmute yourself to participate in the discussion with our speakers to learn more around the questions that you wanted to ask. So I think we can stop sharing for a minute so that we can see all the panelists a little bit better. It's great to see the faces here. We have a few questions in the chat, which are actually coming from Wolfgang around heating in Scandinavian cities. It feels like there are more answers than questions, to be honest. But before that, Naila was asking about Norwegian cities and how the heating system seems to be electrified and how that's impacting the way you work, because it seems like this is not really a key topic for you. And it makes me think that this is probably the same situation for Reykjavik in Iceland, who's benefiting from really good geothermal heating. So that's probably why you're not seeing those things as big numbers in their table. So this is obviously context specific. I think I wanted to maybe, oh, we have questions. I was going to say, so we've got, I'm going to start with a question, and then we'll go to the first question we've got in the Q&A. So I wanted to start by asking about what you presented us in Oslo, and how I'm seeing that intersecting a little bit with Fraser's presentation, because both of these presentations mentioned that essentially financial tools like a budget or like a citizen in Exeter's position seem to be quite key in being able to orchestrate the type of investment and so actions that you're making. But I'm wondering if, to make that possible, you found that you had to sort of take intermediary steps. That means like building certain capabilities in your team so that this kind of budget can be built, maybe in terms of data. So what did you have to sort of do first to make that kind of budgeting system possible?
I guess I can start by answering that one. I have to first admit that I wasn't there in the first rounds of the climate budget, but I mean, one of the things that made it more possible for us was, of course, that we have a greenhouse gas emission inventory that it started being made for each municipality in Norway by the Norwegian Environment Agency. So that sort of sparked our ability to start doing this type of work and start chasing emissions in the different sectors. And then there was the political will to find a new system for ensuring that climate measures are followed up. This was sort of a work in process where maybe the first year the calculations, the climate budget wasn't necessarily that great. We couldn't quantify too many things, and then we've slowly developed the capacity to do this and sort of refined our inputs to each of these budget conferences. So you can imagine, you saw that wheel with the budget conferences, and in May, for example, there's the main one there. We try to have the new measures for this year's climate budget identified and quantified, so that information is ready when the politicians have to decide what they want to do. So that took a while to sort of formalize that entire process. I don't know if it quite answers your question, but I don't have the entire backstory.
No, thanks. That's very useful. In the Q&A.
I just thought I could try, if that's okay. I think currently Oslo is quite fortunate politically in that we have a city government which has a high priority in work on climate. So I think everything becomes easier when the political will is there. And we have a strong political will right now. And I think the reasoning behind putting this as a climate budget is that often in cities everywhere is the real power is within the finance department, right? And the treasury. And that's why we wanted to make them accountable, because they hold the power. And if people have to report to them, they will oblige. If they will report to us, they will not oblige as much. So this is sort of like, we try to make a creative tool that makes people actually do something. But I think we are fortunate, and we could not have done this without the political backing.
We've got Ron next to you, who is working with the Reykjavik Climate Action Plan, and you have in your plan very precise, like estimations of cost, estimations of impact. You've got indicators already in your tables for each of the actions we want to undertake. And I wonder if you've linked that a little bit to the idea of budgeting, and whether your finance department is involved in creating your action plan.
Mm-hmm. Well, only partly actually. And after the climate action plan was made and the goal on carbon neutrality, there has been more kind of investment plan made with, how can you say it, with the sustainability angles. So maybe as reaction to COVID, that was part of that reaction to have green investment and connect the budget to climate friendly projects and so on. But what I actually miss is a stronger connection between the budget and the financial projects on climate issues. Because we are lucky as Oslo that we are having the political commitment, and this is a path that the politicians are agreeing on going through. And but how can you say it? We have and maybe I'm too specific on the issue, but we have a special finance system, and I agree with Sophie. You know, they have to go to the finance department to have, you know, agreement and answer to them on special projects. So that is maybe, if I can just talk a little bit about how different approach climate issues have to have, because it is the planning approach that is very important on how to you know, have the big picture and the consultation with the public and so on. But and I think that Reykjavik is very strong on that. But then you also need the financial connection, and we could be stronger at that. I'm not saying that we're weak, but that is the part that I think we could work better on. And the example on carbon-free construction places from Oslo, that is something that we are looking to. And again, you are looking into what other cities are doing, and maybe what cities that are similar to your city. As I forgot to mention about the electricity and our district heating, that we have both geothermal and hydro. You know, that is something that we do not even count for. We have that kind of luxury. So that is why mobility is the main challenge. Yes, but again, I think climate issues are so complicated. You need like everyone aboard. You know, it's the planning approach and then the financing backing you up, actually. I hope that answered some of the question.
Could I ask a follow-up question to that, Ron? What I really enjoyed was the level of detail. Even though it seems obvious, it's not, that the level of detail in how you explained who has to be involved, and in different aspects of something like the creation of a bicycle lane network and its maintenance, which all of them, again, it seems obvious, but in reality, this can be very complex because each of that involves departments with existing commitments, existing priorities, existing personalities, and they all need to be aligned. How hard or how easy has it been to create that internal alignment? Because again, even if there's political commitment, that doesn't mean that the civil servants play along, of course, right? They might not. What have you done to enable that internal alignment around your portfolio of actions, and what made the difference in enabling you to achieve that?
Exactly. This is a very good question, and to the point, because and maybe not talking about what I have done personally, but because I'm very lucky to have a very strong support of the director of the Department of Environment. And it like trickling to every kind of department that the focus is on climate. You know, it is in the municipal plan and the climate policy. That is the focus on making the city more livable and exciting and so on. It's all combined. But again, about the bicycle lanes, and I can take an example of that one, and how can I say it, how frustrating it can be sometimes when, okay, there was a political, and that this is back, and now I'm going back a little bit in history. Please bear with me. And it started in 2010. Then it started to have political will to make a bicycle plan of Reykjavik, Iceland, here up in north, where the weather is so bad and it's dark and icy roads and so on. And everyone was talking, oh, these crazy politicians, they cannot do this. But anyhow, it was made a bicycle plan, and we were looking to Nordic cities that were a lot of people bicycled, even if it was bad weather. So it was an ambitious plan of having 100 kilometers laid in 10 years, something like that. When I come to the city in 2011, this has barely started, and it's not a lack of political will. It was not obvious, maybe for the steering committee or something, and I'm not blaming anyone. It's just how things go. That how tedious the planning procedure could be. You know, just where are the lanes going to be? How are they going to be? How are they designed? So it was a kind of experiment, and you see that in Reykjavik we have different kinds of bicycle lanes from that time, and so it was kind of experimental phase that we had for almost like 80 years or something, 5 or 8 years, and now it's more. It's more, how can you say it? It's more focus. You know the planning procedure, and I was maybe simplifying the example, but that was not clear at the moment. It maybe had distributed opinions of different kinds of solutions. But if you design a bicycle lane, you also have to think about the maintenance, because it cannot be hard to maintenance the road for making the snow go away and so on, and then nobody uses it in the winter. But we have examples of that kind of bicycle lanes within Reykjavik. So that was kind of one experiment. So actually that was not myself that got into the process of that. That was just the strong political commitment, and how can you say it, my supervisor, that is the focus of the political committee to make things better, and the steering committee of the bicycle plan. So that is how things got better in that field. Hope I answered your question.
No, certainly, and I think one of the things I really want to emphasize in this work is that none of us see something like a portfolio approach as sort of magic or mystical language. At the end of the day, It is deeply human work, where a series of tools like the institutional tool of a climate budget can help the coordination of actions. And I think both your stories illustrate really well both the very human side of it and the way in which many different interventions need to be connected, and how different enabling conditions need to be part of your portfolio. Again, working with community groups and schools has been mentioned, working with procurement contracts has been mentioned, working through the maintenance contracts has been mentioned. Again, these are all part of an intentional portfolio of actions. They involve different actors. It might not be the most headline-grabbing work, but it is essential work to ensure that the overall approach has that coherence. Thank you very much for the detail.
We've got a question for you, Oslo, which is actually coming from your side, I think, Ron, your colleague next to you, around what are your key recommendations for public engagement in relation to climate matter? Because you seem to have done well, and I would add, what are your key recommendations even on linking your climate budget to that kind of public engagement? Because it seems that sometimes behavioral changes in the wider population is hard to account in a climate budget, I would assume. So that's probably where public engagement becomes very important around it, as well as a mean of coordination. So I'm very curious to hear more also about that.
I will try to say something, Borge, if that's okay. I think it's funny because this is maybe an area where we think we might need to work a little bit more on. So but I think we have done some things that are good, and I think we have tried to engage citizens on a very local level on sort of growing vegetables in the city, or every time we change a park, we involve citizens living nearby. Every time we do infrastructure changes related to electrification or anything, we involve the neighborhood, right? So that is part of it, is because of the Norwegian system, I think, which is quite inclusive, and the specific Oslo governance system, which is not directly related to climate. But then we also have done quite some good cases on work related directly to the actions in the climate budget. So I think our approach has been slightly different from this NetZeroCity approach, which is to put everybody, all the stakeholders in the same room, let's discuss and let's make a big plan. That's actually not how we've done it. Or we've adopted a climate strategy, yes, and have a lot of input on that. And from then on, we go towards the action, and we involve construction companies, on certain activities. We try to have these emission-free construction sites. We try to work with different entrepreneurs within the city. We also work on this business for climate coalition, where we forge networks. But it's always linked to activities to make it as activity oriented and tangible as possible, and less sort of endless workshops, because climate can get quite abstract and we are trying to make it concrete.
Yeah, I can just add to that the climate budget in itself is more of like the technical sort of the city's tool. And of course, people read this, but the actual stakeholder involvement is concrete on the different measures. So before we have requirements in different procurements, this has been discussed in, for example, the Business for Climate Network, but on the concrete level, not necessarily on the high sort of strategic level that the climate budget is. But of course, the climate strategy, when it was adopted, there was a lot of participatory activities.
I was wondering about that, Borge, now that you mention it, because there is a way of reading Oslo's climate budget approach as a sort of a very internal municipal tool, right? Which would make it a way of internally coordinating the portfolio. But you also seem to say it equally works as a way of coordinating the actions across other actors, asset owners and other stakeholders. And you say that happens at the level of individual measures within the climate budget. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because I wouldn't like people to walk away with the wrong impression. It's for municipal coordination, but also wider, if I understand you correctly.
Well, it's you know, when we're developing these concrete measures, that's where the participatory approach is. So it's not necessarily in the actual climate budget and the calculations and the whole analysis. That is more internal, actually. But like I said, when we're working on developing these new measures, for example, these requirements in the public procurements, there's been a lot of conversations with businesses that are out there to, if this is possible, before we set a requirement, we make sure it's possible to do so, and that we have the business community as much on board as possible. But the actual sort of climate budget system is more designed to, okay, we've calculated how much emission reduction this is worth. Who is responsible for following up that these requirements are set in every single public procurement? Well, it's the individual agency, so they all have to report that they are actually setting these requirements to us. So it's a little bit more of an internal tool in that respect.
When you're having those discussions with stakeholders, either from the private sector or more civil sector, do you find that you have to use maybe a slightly different rhetoric or a slightly different vocabulary? Because I see that in the case of Exeter and Reykjavik, you've formulated your objectives around co-benefits rather than around direct emissions. As in Reykjavik, you're talking about healthy modes of transport, like that's one of your objectives, for example. And in Exeter, they're talking about a livable city as opposed to a green city. Do you find that at the implementation stage, when it's about getting the actors to implement, it's useful to have that type of more pro-benefit centered type of implementation? Or is it still very much around emissions as the main goal for everyone?
Should I start, Sophie, or do you want to? Well, we don't. The two people here, we don't do all of the. I mean, we're a big organization, so in terms of the rhetoric, I can't comment that much on it. But what I can say is that we have these different surveys that we do, and climate is accepted, and the climate goals have lots of support, both from the business sector and from the private citizens in Oslo. So I would say in Oslo, there's probably more focus on emissions than there are in other cities, where maybe it's more beneficial to look at these co-benefits. That is my general impression when I talk to different cities, that maybe re-emphasize emissions more than other cities when they're introducing these different types of climate measures.
I guess my question then goes to Ron, which is a little bit then, why on your side was it that you had to frame your actions around things like the 15-minute city or healthy modes of travel? Mm-hmm. Is there like a specific reason why it ended up being like this?
Mm-hmm. I think, well, it goes a long way back, but actually what makes a city, it's the people that are within the city, and that you are allowing to being there, and that the environmental quality is good, and that you're having fun there and so on. And it was in the planning literature since ages that a more dense urban community brings this all together. So how can you say that was maybe the main umbrella over the planning for the city in general. But we have seen, and that was back in 2011, and now again for the new IPCC report, how important cities are in the transformation towards carbon neutrality. And that is change of infrastructure and making cities more dense, that we can have walking distances. And I don't know what Paris have been talking, I think that's 50 minutes. We are not finding up the wheel. We are like hearing what is going on in the world and so on. So how can you say it? It started with the planning, but the climate focus goes along with that. And I also maybe want to add one thing, because Borge is talking about Oslo, making focus on the emissions. You have been doing a great job on reducing emissions. That is good to see the line going down. It has not been as clear in Reykjavik. We have, of course, been growing, but it's very little and frustrating how slow it goes. So maybe that kind of focus you have to have a little bit more on. But then again, I think the mission, to be a part of the mission, that is the opportunity to focus on the actions that really matters on the emissions, because we are going in a certain direction on the planning and making the city more dense, and I think that is just going well, but maybe a little bit of a how can you say it, a little bit of changing the focus on the emissions per se.
Sophie, do you want to come in?
Just a quick comment is on the reducing emissions work. I think it's quite invigorating to work in the city of Oslo because of that. But I don't think that we have done all the action on our own. I will not claim that. I think that Norway has had quite good policies on electric vehicles in general, which has positively contributed to our actions. So this is like the national policies for changing the mobility infrastructure from fossil to electric. So we've got a lot of support from the national government on that. And then I think we have been fortunate to not have this big energy issue. I realize that it might be easier for us in some ways, and we are also working on all the small things, like encouraging people to ride bikes and try to use more solar and insulation in people's houses, which gives small results, not these big results. So we have been working a little bit, prioritize the big emission, big causes for emissions, and have succeeded on some things, but we've also had support from national authorities.
I think that's. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, maybe just a comment on that, because there has been, again, this is a combination of planning, but also using, like Norway, electrifying the fleet, because we have such a abundant of green energy actually. So that is a kind of luxury. So we had support of the government until recently, and actually it has been a little bit of a stunning fact that was in the news that we have used 9 times more money to support electrical cars than we have been supporting public transport. So that is not a good climate action, but just to put it in a perspective, how expensive support can be on certain issues.
But I think again, if this is really valuable nuance, because again, the portfolio is not a rabbit that you pull out of a hat. It's not a magic trick. It's a representation and a way of thinking about the work that you need to do in all its coherence. And your articulation, Sophie, saying, well, much of this only works if the national level does its part, and being able to define where the boundaries of what you can achieve on your own and what you certainly can't achieve, where they are, is an integral aspect, of course, of the portfolio building, because it's the only way to get to a climate approach and represented in the Climate City contract and the action plan that is ultimately fit for purpose, right? So again, that's why we also want to emphasize there's no single way for us of visualizing what a portfolio should look like. We've made several different ones over the years, and we happen to like showing this stuff graphically. That can be helpful. But it's about what your portfolio does, not what it looks like, that we emphasize. There's no single methodology. It's a series of things of shared starting points and understandings. So thanks for reinforcing that. There's a question in the chat.
From Borge, actually. Do you want to speak to it directly, Borge?
Yeah. No, I threw in that. I just couldn't seem to get on the Q&A. I was hoping Haran could speak a little bit more about work with indirect emissions. I just saw that you had some scope 3 emissions that you were looking at, and I seemed to see some of the actions were directed towards this. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that type of work. That's something that we're sort of starting a little bit more with now, and we're struggling to get good indicators for how to track that sort of thing. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about it.
Thank you. Well, this is actually complicated because I think you are aware how the talk of climate actions can go on a distributed paths and so on. So there has been a lot of focus on scope 3 emissions, but again, the data is very vague on scope 3 emissions, and we have mainly been looking at into the building sector and also on communication projects. So we have been lucky actually to have consultations that are very interested in scope 3 emissions, and have been doing calculations on that one. And also partly it is interest of certain research people here in Reykjavik in Iceland. But I think this is something that you have to be a little bit cautious of, because the conversation goes from the most important emissions that you have to tackle, and the conversation goes from that one to maybe the building sector. Of course, it's very important, but the data is very vague, and you cannot be clear of how much of construction is imported, because we are an island. We have to import, and our consumption emissions are huge. They are, of course, I think in comparison, they are larger than our direct emissions, but we have to focus at one thing at a time, because I find that when you have such a detailed action plan and a lot of actions, there is just a need to, focus on just the 15 actions and take that for at least the next years. Of course, meanwhile, and I think it's good within the mission to focus on the main emission sector. And I read somewhere that the focus will be on scope 3 emissions after 2030. So that is something how you actually can put the elephant into smaller bites, that you focus on on the emissions that are most at hand. But of course, if you have the luxury to work on scope 3 emissions, then it's great. But again, an answer, it's the interest of the research community and the consultations that we have here in Reykjavik.
Thanks a lot to the three of us and Joost as well for contributing to the questions. It's 3:59 for me, probably 2:59 for some others and 4:59 for some others. But I think I'll come to a conclusion, and I really enjoyed our discussion personally, as well as the presentation. I hope everyone watching us is feeling the same way. I just want to make sure that we keep this conversation going. So as a conclusion, I'll essentially answer many of the questions we've received in the chat and in the Q&A about where to find the presentations, where to find the slides. And I want to add to those questions, where can we keep the conversation going? So I'm going to share my screen and show you what is essentially on the portal as an opportunity to see the presentation, see the videos, the video recording, but also to keep the conversation going. So if you go on the portal, you will have your normal landing page. And when you go to the menu, go to events, there you have, this is not events, this is here. When you go to the menu and events, you've got the collection of all the events, past and present one. And if you go to the event you're interested in, you'll be able to land on the event page, which is where you can join the webinar. Also where we put a description of it in case you want to know if it's relevant for you or not. And then we have a normal publication possibility. And here right now, we've already put, for example, a link with all the relevant information for all the three presentations we've had today. So we've got one for yours, Sophie and Borge, we've got one for yours, Run, and we've got also one for Fraser's with all the relevant links if you all want to find them. You can keep the conversation going in comments with each of those topics, for example. And I think it's definitely something I would welcome as a member of the consortium to be able to answer a question and also see you as cities sort of get on this discussion, because we know it's going to be a long one. And very soon here, one of our colleagues is going to post the link to the slides as well as the link to the video recording. It's the same thing for all webinars. You are invited to go and chat about each webinar you've been part of and the ones you are going to be part of in the next coming days as well. That's for us a way of essentially not just stopping at those green interactions, but keep going in between the webinars and when you actually have questions. So do really feel free to go there and contribute and ask questions or just react or share things you've done that might be relevant to what has been shared during the webinar. That's something we will really appreciate seeing, because we know how essential it is for you as cities to also share the information you have. So I'll stop here. And I think we're coming to the end of this webinar. So again, thank you to everyone who joined us today. The numbers are already going down because it's free past. But thanks a lot, everyone, for joining, and a special thanks, obviously, to our speakers, to everyone that contributed to the presentation, to the selection of speakers, to asking questions. That was really nice to have you all here. And I think we'll see each other in the next webinar then. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.